ربيع تبادى بهذه الصدور وعمر تنادى بها أحلى شعور وإخوان خير لهم غاية.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And as Ramadan draws near, we probably, as this will go public, inshallah ta'ala, will be possibly a day away from Ramadan. Therefore, it's very important topic, and that is determining the capacity of a sa'. And a sa', which is very difficult to pronounce with the sad and the ain, a sa' is a particular capacity. And before I go into it, let me just give you a brief background. What I'm sort of referring to is the paper, which should also be available from our website, which for most of these research papers you'll know is available from our IRTIS website, which is www, I don't know why I'm looking at the paper because it's not on there, www.irtis.org.uk, and IRTIS stands for the institution, or IRTIS stands for Institution for the Revival of Traditional Islamic Sciences. Quite a mouthful. Anyway, let's get to the topic of today. And that is, we know that there's a number of weights and capacities which are mentioned in the body of the Ahadith, and some are related directly to acts of worship, so therefore to act upon them exactly is necessary. Now, there's a number of papers that are already available written on the topic which are quite detailed, but our topic for today is going to be somewhat focused, and we are, as I've already mentioned, going to focus on the sa'. Get the ayn out. And the reason why we're focusing on that is because there's a number of things associated with it. One is, for example, the sadaqa al-fitr. Now, obviously, when Ramadan is complete, we're supposed to have given already before Eid Salah the sadaqa al-fitr. So I advise you to give that through Ramadan, particularly in the last 10 days, because the last 10 days rewards are multiplied many times. So that's a time to make that donation. And it also, when you are giving your sadaqatul fitr to somebody, is to say to that person that, look, can you promise me, or can you make sure that this money will reach the poor? And if you can, then obviously give that money, because it's got to get to the poor as well. Similarly, because it's the month of Ramadan, for some of us, we might be either too old or too weak. It could be due to age. It could be that it's a suckling mother, or it's a pregnant woman who's going to struggle to keep fast. Or it could be somebody who's exceptionally ill and they don't look like there's any possibility of recovery. But for each case, I'm not necessarily giving you any fatwa here. For each case, it's advisable that you speak to a reputable mufti who can then look into your particular case and decide whether you should be giving fidya. And also kaffara, expiation, when a person commits a sin, whether it's kaffaratul zihar or kaffaratul yameen, making a promise, a vow, and then breaking that vow. These are also associated with this volume or this capacity of food, commodity, whether it's wheat or barley, which is usually wheat or barley, but it can also be raisins and dates, which is given to the poor. And so that's why it's very important to know that. As a background, we know from the time of the Prophet ﷺ that there's three types really. One is wazn, which is something which is weighed. One is qiyas, which is something which is measured by, as we would say, two-dimensional. And one is scale, which is akyal, which is a capacity. You could use the word volume, but I'd stick to capacity, because in many of the times the foodstuffs which are being measured are solids. So it makes it a lot easier to understand, and normally we associate volume with liquids. So we have weight, which is mass, so that's one measure. Another is a two-dimensional. So here we're talking about when we refer to the dhira, and we mention the khatwa, the steps, and so you can see that the distance from the tip of the finger to the top of the shoulder. And likewise, we can talk about the meal, which is the Arabic mile, and its distance. So these are measures, two-dimensional. And then we have the three-dimensional measure, which is not referring to the area, but referring to capacity or volume. Our focus is going to be on this scale, this capacity volume, because a sa', a measure of this sa' is actually a three-dimensional capacity of a vessel. Okay. But we will naturally also discuss wazn, because there will be some discussion about how wazn is related to the sa'. So we will discuss that as well. But just as a background, there are a number of traditions which mention that weight and capacity should be based on. So I'll quote one for you here, which is mentioned in Bayhaqi, in which it says, Al-mikyalu mikyalu ahli al-Madina wal-waznu waznu ahli Makkah. That mikyal, capacity, is the capacity of the people of Medina, and wazn, weight, is the measure of the weight of the people of Makkah. So meaning that they should be the fundamentals. They're the standard, if you can use that word to describe it. And why wazn for Mecca and why mikyal for Medina? Well, it's obvious. It's very practical. Islam is a very practical religion. People were tradesmen and businessmen in Mecca, so the things that they were usually using was gold and silver. And gold and silver is determined in terms of its value, in terms of its measure, by its weight. Not by its quantity, but its weight. And in Medina, Medina was a farming city, a city where farming was the main preoccupation for people. As a result, commodities were commodities were measured by capacity. Even now we have similar bushels in which an item is measured in its three-dimensional capacity for food stuff. So that's what it's going to be based on. So what do you expect to hear in the next sort of 20 minutes, half an hour or so, is that we're going to try to determine what the SAR is, and then try to obviously give an answer in its quantity so that people can better understand what it is that they must give. But I will say from the outset, as you're probably aware, the fuqaha, there is disagreement amongst them in terms of what it's based upon, how is it calculated, and things of that nature. I will, inshallah ta'ala, discuss the four madhahib, but I'm not going to actually put forward to you their evidences. This is not it's beyond the scope of this paper, it's beyond the scope of this recording, so therefore we're going to stick to that. Anyway, with that should serve as an introduction. Let's actually now get into the meat of it. Now, let's talk about the Ozan first. And when we speak about the Ozan, one of the things which is mentioned is the dirham. And the dirham is something which is used because it was weighed, and the weight was standardized. Well, there was some discussion. According to Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam, he says that there were, from his teachers, he says there were two types of dirham in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And there was one which was as-sawda al-wafiyya, which was 8 dawaniq, and the other one which is the at-tabriya al-itq, which was 4 dawaniq. So there's clearly a difference between the two. So when Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was going to mint and prepare the dirham, and according to some he was the first, he feared that if he was to adopt one path, then what he would be doing is taking less zakah. But if he was to adopt the other one, then it could be that he's taking people's wealth. So what he decided to do was take the average of the two, and he considered 6 dawaniq to be a dirham. However, this position is challenged, and the correct view is that the 6 dawaniq was already fixed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Makes sense. We've had a number of hadith which I've already quoted one, but there's a hadith which mention the fact that this was associated with the Ahl Makkah, so it clearly states that was known at the time. And similarly, it goes against sound understanding that if the Prophet ﷺ was fixing the nisab for zakah, then clearly he would have already mentioned it would be based upon a well-known quantity. It would not have been based upon something which was subjective, which clearly having 2 is clearly making it subjective. So now what we've got this dirham, but there's lots of opinions about how much the dirham weighed. We need something which is fairly standard and independent, and that's what we're seeking here. And I'll tell you again, I'll stress the importance of that. It's because we need something outside of these measures to be able to act as a standard, to be able to act as a independent variable, something beyond the experiment that we're going to perform, which can then be used to then associate and measure against all the others. So we have again 2 views with respect to how many grains of barley, how many grains of barley are equivalent to a dirham. We have one view which the 3 madhahib quote, and this is that it should be 50 2/5 of an average size barley grain. So that's 50 2/5. The view of the Ahnaf is that it should be 70 average barley grains. So clearly you're going to see, based on that difference, because you're talking about an approximately a third difference there between the Ahnaf and the three madhahib. So you're going to be, it's going to be significantly different. The Ahnaf, both their view is, and this is the description which is given by Abu Muhammad ibn Atiyah, that the grain has to be a rough barley grain, okay, of average size, which is not peeled, meaning it's still within its hull, it's still within its sort of outer bran layer. And you'll see images of this on the paper if you go onto the website. So it's got to be a rough barley grain of average size, which is not peeled by its ends being cut and is taken out of its outer bran layer and hull. Now, the type of grain which is taken out of the outer bran layer and hull is referred to as pearl barley. So we're not talking about pearl barley. So if you used pearl barley, then the actual weight of pearl barley would be less, or the dirham, if we were calculating the dirham, would be less based upon pearl harbi. So we have to, pearl harbi, let me try that again, pearl barley. So we have to be using the barley which has got the hull and outer bran already on it. So this is what you could call the rough barley, okay? Since we're talking about the dirham, I'm going to mention the dinar as well, because these were the two types of coins which existed. There were other types of coins, but these were the two main types of coins by which people would make purchases. And that is the dinar. Now, the dirham was made of silver and the dinar was made of gold. And the dinar is also called the Shar'i Mithqal, and it is 100 grams of rough barley. 100 grams, 100 grains. Having a bad day, okay? 100 grains, my apologies, because grams wasn't used as a measure in those days. So 100 grains. And according to others, it was 72. So again, we're seeing a difference. So again, it's around about a 43% difference in both cases between the dinar and the dirham. So 43% bigger is the dinar compared to the dirham, and I appreciate it's made of gold as well rather than silver. And that's important, because theoretically we need to understand that, because when I do some experimental work which I will present to you, we need to see if that 43% exists. Now, question comes up, why is the difference between the Ahnaf and the other three madhahib with this? Surely the two weights should be the same. It could be possible that the Hijazi grain is heavier, either due to its size or weight, or is that the weight difference, which means every measure, and so we're not really sure, and we're going to sort of discuss that. And with this weight difference, okay, with this weight difference, this will mean that every measure which is based upon the dirham now will also be different, because this is the fundamental, this is first principle. The first principle is to determine the number of grains of barley that would equate to a dirham. That's our first principle. So we need to explore. Now, if you've got a difference between the two, significant difference, roughly a third difference, based upon the dirham, then the mud, the ratal, the sa, everything else which comes out from that is also going to be different by approximately a third. We're trying to understand, why is there the difference? Is it because there was a size difference? Was the Hijazi grain heavier? Was that the case? And therefore, having less of them would mean that the weight is equal to so the dirham weight was equal, but it was made up of different number of grains because of the size. Is there such a thing? So we're going to turn to that. And I looked at a number of papers which are available. One was from the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board from 2005. Which then found that the average grain weight did not vary when comparing grain grown in the north with the south. And here we're talking about the UK. And the UK, the climate is significantly different when comparing the north of the UK, which is in Scotland, down to the south of England. So there is a remarked difference, or a marked difference, if I can get my words right. Today I'm really struggling, aren't I? Maybe it's the fear of Ramadan that's frightening me before it arrives. There's a marked difference between the two. Yet still, from the paper on page 24, there was nothing to show that the weight was different. So climate, even the changing climate, is not having an impact on the grain size. Furthermore, there was some research carried out in the Czech Republic from 6 barley cultivators across the country, in which 6 varieties of barley were measured in various ways, and it was found to be remarkably consistent in the grain. So we're going to dismiss because if we've talked about a significant climate change in the UK, we don't believe that there's a significant climate change between Baghdad and, say, Medina. It can't have been, because the climate is roughly the same. Now, we can't expect, if we're not seeing a size or weight difference in the grain in the UK when there is a marked difference in climate, then we're going to deduce from that we wouldn't have seen it either between Baghdad and also Medina. That means that some knowledge reached the fuqaha for them to have decided on 70, and rather than deciding on the 50, where did I get to? The 50 and 2/5 barley grain. There must have been a reason for that. So that's hopefully concluded that. So we've now got a first principle, we've got a starting point, something which is independent, something which isn't significantly varying. You say, of course there will be variability, but it's not a huge variability, and it's something that we can determine now in 2017. It's not something that we have to base it on theory. So we can work out, using first principles to work out the dirham, then from the dirham we can actually calculate the rest. We can calculate the sa'. So first of all, what we need to do is calculate the sa'. We have to first calculate a mud, as 4 muds make a sa', and for that we need to work out how many ratals make a mud, and then we need to work out how many dirhams make a ratal. As they're all based upon one another, the only independent measure that we have are these barley grain. So let's look at now how many ratals are in a mud and how many muds are in a sa'. So there's again a number of views. We have the view of Imam Nawawi, which is a view of the Shafi'iyya and the Hanabila, and they say it's 128 and 4/7. So 128 dirhams and 4/7 of a dirham. That is a ratal. Others have removed the fraction and they said no, it's just 128 dirham, and that's the view that the Malikis take. And the Hanafi view is that the ratal is 130 shari dirhams. And in fact, we have a little point from Mullah Khusro in which he mentions in Ghar al-Ahkam that it is compulsory upon every Muslim to give half a sa' of wheat, grain, or its flour, or its gruel from a sa', which is 1,040 dirhams. Now he's reached this 1,040 dirhams. How does he reach that? Well, we're going to soon see that 8 ratals are in a sa'. So 8 ratals, if we're saying 130 dirhams in each ratal, if you multiply 130 by 8, you'll get 1,040 dirhams. Now I appreciate I'm going slightly fast, and for some of you you'll be saying, whoa, slow down, we're just about trying to work that out. Don't worry, all this is within the paper, so go at your own pace. I suggest downloading or printing the paper and then watching the video at the same time, so then at least you're getting an understanding of where I'm going with this. So what we have now is we're now getting an idea of actually how many shari dirhams, which we can work out from an independent, a fairly standard item, the grain, which we can use, which has been described well as well, and we can now then work out the ratal from that. But what I want to say before we move on is the interesting point that Mullah Khusro makes, which he says that you can use both grain, flour, and gruel, right? Now it seems to be suggesting that they will fill the same volume, but we need to see this, because we need to look at this. How is that possible? That flour is obviously less dense than grain, yet the same volume is used. Okay, and this is where many times we get a little bit, some confusion comes in. And you'll see on table 1 the densities of these commodities which I've mentioned, and you can see clearly there's a big difference between the wheat grain and the wheat flour. The wheat grain is 0.785 grams per centimeter cubed, and the wheat flour is 0.481 grams per centimeter cubed. So it's nearly, it's about 2/3, if not pushing towards half the density. So anyway, that's the ratal sorted out. Okay, the ratal, we've got how many? We've got 8 ratals in a sa'. The mud. Now the mud is, the Ahnaf view is that there's 2 ratal in a mud. And that means if 1 ratal is 130, then that will make it 260 dirham in weight. The other view is, the other Aimma, is that it's 1 ratal and a third. Now this will bring it, and they're already using less, they're using 128. Where are we? There we are, 128 and 4/7 for the Shafi and the Hanabila, and the Maliki are using 128. And then they were multiplying it by 1 and a third, whereas the Ahnaf are multiplying it by 2. So that's significantly lower. We're on 170.24. Compare that to 260. So the Ahnaf value is significant. The Sa is going to be significantly more than the Shafi, the Hanbali, and the Maliki. Khair, let's now reach the Sa. There's some agreement amongst the Fuqaha, excellent, and they say that 4 muds make a Sa. So therefore, according to Ahnaf, it is 8 ratal, which we've already worked out from Mullah Khusro rahmatullah alayhi, who mentioned that it's 1040 dirhams. For the others, when we calculate it, they said 5 1/3 ratal, and that's equivalent to just under 681 dirhams. To be precise, it is 680.94. So we got 680.94, and for the Ahnaf, it's 1040. So their Sa is going to be significantly heavier than the other madhahib. Now, what I also did was just to kind of a short, not a in-depth literature review, but I did a literature review just to see if the research of our elders in particular, to see what kind of decision they'd reach. And I put some of those in table 2. For the majority, I found they were using secondary sources. Nobody actually went and got some barley seeds. Well, that wasn't recorded. They may have done so, but it wasn't recorded. It wasn't highlighted in their papers. Nobody actually went and got the barley seeds and weighed them. In fact, they were using secondary sources. They were using Indian weights and then trying to change those into other weights, and then eventually change those into grams where that was possible. The only place where I found mentioning is Mufti Muhammad Shafi Sahib, rahmatullah alayhi, in Jawahir al-Fiqh. In there, he actually mentions that he went and he got some barley seeds. He picked some sort of average size barley seeds, and then he went to several places where they would weigh them for him, and he recorded those weights in the Indian units, and then eventually they were changed into sort of Western units of grams and kilograms. That's the only place I can find of any work. And even if you look at table 2, you can see there's a big difference. We've got 3.1842 from Jawahir al-Fiqh. From Ahsan al-Fatawa, we've got 3.4852. So, and then for Imdad al-Ahkam, we have about 3.266. So a variety there in the sort of 3 to 3.5 kgs mark for a Sa. But actually there's even more variety. There's 2 other publications which have gathered the work of the elders. One is the Fatawa Darul Uloom Zakaria, and in there we see a number of, but again primarily the Indian measures are used, which are then converted into grams and kilograms. And we have more recently Maulana Yusuf Shabir, who's written a paper just recently, and he discusses that, and in there he found the range from 1.106 to 2.32, and here we're talking about half a sa of wheat. But it's the range that I'm talking about. So you've got a huge range there that's taking place. Where is this huge range coming from? Why isn't it so easy? Why can't we all agree on a value? Remember, this is all amongst the Ahnaf. I'm not comparing this with the Shawafi or the Hanabila or the Malikiya, in which their position is completely different. We understand that. That's already been explained, because that's based on the first principle of the fact of the number of barley grain which is being used to determine the dirham. But here it's the same. So why such a big difference? There's huge difference here. And majority of the references that I've given to you are of the same particular school of understanding or approach to their fiqh. So you'd think that there wouldn't be such a huge range. You know, you're talking literally double, 1.106 to 2.32. So I made a few points on page 5 as to what could be some of the reasons why this has happened. One is there is a mud vessel which is going around, and there's a plastic version and a metal version. So it could be that the ulama were using these, so just sort of filling it up. Now, for some, they might have leveled off the surface of the mud. For others, it might have been slightly packed. Some of them might have made some effort to pack it. Some of them might have just filled up. Because the experiment is not actually mentioned at all, and in most cases, as I've said, the experiment hasn't actually been discussed, but rather it's been relied upon somebody else and secondary sources have been gathered. But that's one possibility, that we're using different muds. That could be it. It could be that because of use of other units. Now, these are units which weren't standardized as such, and this were most likely pieces of metal or pieces of stone which can quite easily get chipped. And these were being used on the pan of one scale, and then the barley seeds were being placed on the other pan. And that could explain the difference between the two. It could also be at the time when conversion is taking place from the Indian units into the Western units, and it could be that errors could creep in there. But the key point, I believe, is, and that I've mentioned that at the end, is that there is no first-hand research which is being discussed. Again, I can say they may have taken place, but it's not mentioned in their research. The research clearly talks about taking established Indian units of Indian weights and then comparing, changing them from one to a tola or whatever, and then eventually converting that into kilograms. So there's a lot of messing around, there's a lot of calculations or whatever, and that's where errors can slip in, especially obviously it was in days gone by when we didn't have calculators. So majority of this is being done, copied from one person to another, and that's when errors do come in, because there's no way for someone, say in my position, to actually verify the raw data, because there's no raw data available. And that's the point on point 4, that even though we have in Jawahir al-Fiqh what clearly is being mentioned by the researcher, that he's actually going around and measuring this, we still have problems there. The reason why we have problems there is, again, there is no, in fact, I discussed that, so I don't want to jump that. In fact, I will jump that. But before I jump that, I want to mention also that the Sa' using the mud vessel is problematic, and I've mentioned why that is, because there's no agreement on the vessel size. Secondly, its accuracy cannot be verified, because was it really the vessel that was handed from the person before, who handed it from the person before, who handed it from the person before? And that leads me to the soundness of the chain of narrators. There is some questioning that's going on at the moment about whether the soundness is absolutely sound. Let's talk about Jawahir al-Fiqh, because that was the most important research that we could see, that there is a scientific approach that's being utilized, in that a measure which is used is standard and independent, which are these barley grains. Having said that though, the measuring apparatus that would have been available to Mufti Shafi Saab, and the fact that it was measured in Indian units first and then converted, is a potential for error, and that's where error can come in. Also, there's a high possibility, or rather high probability, that there would have been a significant range in grain size, and as a result the sample to sample consistency would vary. Now, we don't have the raw data as to how many samples were taken to be scientifically sound, and then an average taken of that. That's very, very important. So we can't really discuss because we don't have the raw data, we can't carry out the analysis. So what we need to do is we need a scientifically sound approach, which is to determine the dirham's weight using an independent standard with little variability, using grams and milligrams on a scientific balance. That's what we're really after. And we don't have that. So to calculate, then we can calculate the mud, the ratl and the sa'. So as I mentioned, I'm not aware, and hopefully if somebody's watching this or reading the paper, they can make me aware, I'm not aware of any first-hand research which has been carried out as I've highlighted above. So therefore, as a result, we've then planned an experiment to determine the weight of the dirham. So what did we do? Well, I ordered a kilogram batch of whole grain milling wheat and whole grain milling barley from Bro Farm. And it met the criteria that I've already detailed above, in that it was still within its hull, it was still within its outer bran layer, and it was of average size. This was a lengthy discussion with the farmer beforehand, and therefore it was not peeled. It was fairly uniform, which again, it goes through a sieving process. So this is now manufactured and bagged through a sieving process, and the type that grain that would have been available during the Jawahir al-Fiqh studies would not have gone through some kind of sieving process. It would have been literally barley, quite literally off the farm. Whereas now, because we in a consumer demanding world, and the standards that exist with the with food and packaging and everything, there's an expectation, and this was brought out whilst discussing this with the farmer. So we have more average size. So what I did was, we're expecting it to be more repeatable, and with the scientific experiments, repeatability is absolutely essential. So I took 6 samples from this barley grain, and then I weighed them to 3 decimal places in a closed environment so that there would be no air affecting there whatsoever. I didn't touch the grain with my hands, so there'd be no chance of oil or grease transferring onto the grain. I used a whatever you call that thing that you pick things with. Oh, it's in my head, but it won't come out. You know what I mean, don't you? You know those little kind of things which tweezer, that's the word. So I used a tweezer to make sure that nothing was spoiling the grain itself. And I took the wheat grain as well, just to have a little play with, and I'll explain what I did with the wheat grain later. And then what I did was I took the average of the 6 samples to determine the dirham, which then obviously I used to calculate the sa. But also I determined the dinar as well, because had the kit out, I had the experiment ready. Why not? This will help us with the nisab. And then I calculated the ratl and the sa. Now I've already mentioned to you the wheat, and the reason why the wheat is because I wanted to explore this experiment, because I also got some wheat flour, is to see how the volume and the mass relate to one another. So can you use volume, and can you use the capacity and the weight, or do you have to choose one of the two? I wanted to explore that as well. But first, you'll see in table 3, I weighed them, and we had weights 3.673, 3.735, 3.942, 3.797, 3.585, 3.815. So these are twice sieved grain, twice sieved, and there's also me kind of picking out those which obviously look to me to be slightly smaller, so visible to the eye. And then these have been weighed, yet still you're seeing a marked difference, 0.2 grams approximately, between the 6 samples. The average was 3.76. Again, I see in a lot of places where people are going to 4 or 5 decimal places. It's impossible. If you're measuring to 3 decimal places, even to quote at 3 decimal places is probably inaccurate. You'd have to then, when you're taking an average, quote to 2 decimal places. So you see this over accuracy, which is actually not real at all. With the dinar, it was 70, obviously 70 grains for the dirham. For the dinar, it was 100, so I chucked in another 30, and the weights went up to 5.381 for sample A, 5.303 for sample B, 5.409 for sample C, 5.388 for sample D, 5.206 for sample E, and 5.524. Again, you're seeing about a 0.3 roughly difference between the least in weight and the highest, and the average I've taken is 5.37. okay, and before we start discussing these, I just wanted to compare the wheat grain and the wheat flour, and you'll see from table 5 that I took 3 samples of the grain and 3 samples of the flour, and I tried to keep the grain sample weight roughly the same, so you can see they're all roughly the same, and the volume is roughly the same, so it averaged out to be 26.2 grams for the weight of the grain and 36.5 for the volume. And then when you look at the flour, that was also, I tried to keep the same. One sample went slightly AWOL, 24.6, 20.95, 24.63, which gave me 23.4. And I also measured the volumes, and that was 32.44, 32.5, and 43. Now you'll see on the bottom of page 7 that the density of the wheat grain is 0.72 grams per centimeter cubed, but the density of the wheat flour is 0.59 grams per centimeter cube, which is what we'd expect because the flour is lighter than the grain. So in terms of volume, if you look at the volume column, you'll see that the volume of the grain is more than the volume of the flour is more than the grain. But when you look at the weight column, the weight of the grain is more than the weight of the flour. In short, what I'm saying is it's not possible to have both equal weight and equal volume. So if we decide the sa is by volume only, then there will be a difference in weight. And if we decide it's by weight only, then there will be a difference in volume. You cannot, it's impossible to get both to be the same. So we have to decide which one we adopt. Do we adopt the volume or do we adopt the weight? Now that's going to be quite simple because we do not have any independent means of knowing the volume. Apart from this mud vessel which is going around, we do not have any independent means. But we do have for the weight, and that is these barley grain. So for that reason, we're going to focus our efforts on the determining the Shari'i dirham to be able to work out. And just for your pleasure, I have some images so you can see the six samples I had. So I labeled these A, B, C, D, E, F. I hope you can see that. If not, you can see the paper. And then, so this is 70, 70, 70, 70, 70, 70 grains of barley. And then you see 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, which was then added to that for us to work out our dinar. This is a very accurate scientific balance there, in which you can measure down to 3 decimal places, which is very accurate, because if you were just to, I did this just to prove his accuracy. If you were to wave your hand close by, then you'll see that the 3rd decimal place will start to fluctuate. It is for this reason you can see this glass lid which comes over the top, which seals it and prevents any air changes. So you can see it's pretty accurate. And you can see that the seeds are fitting exactly on top of the balance. So it's not as though some seeds are not actually being weighed properly. And there the seeds piled in. And you can see one of the weights that I've recorded as well. So figure 1 on the left hand side I've already explained, and figure 2 I've explained. What you can see on the bottom then in figure 3 is measuring the weight and the volume. So I've got a measuring cylinder there and I've got a weight there. So I can determine the volume of the product and I can determine its weight. Similarly, I've got the flour there. I can determine the weight and I can determine the volume using this experiment to be able to do that. So we've already discussed this and this experiment, so that's already sorted. And now we have the data from this experiment. So let's calculate the sa. Now we're there. We said 130 dirhams was a ratal. There's 2 ratals in a mud, so that makes 260 dirhams. And there's 4 muds in a sa, which makes 1,040 dirhams. So we've got the dirhams. We worked out, if you can see from table 3, that it's 3.6 grams is a Shari dirham. So that becomes 1,040 dirhams multiplied by 3.76 gives us 3,910.4 grams, which converts to 3.910 kilograms is 1 sa. So that's 3.910 kilograms. Half of that is just to divide it by 2, or if you want to be pedantic like I was, 520 dirhams times 3.76 is 1955.2, which gives you 1.955 kilograms, which is half a sa. Okay, so we've got that. So we've got the values now. Then we wanted, as I said, for completion's sake, and as I had already the kit here, we worked out the value for the dinar and the dirham. Now the dirham was 3.76 gram and the dinar was 5.37 grams. So 200 dirhams times 3.7 grams makes 752 grams of silver is the nisab. Based on today's prices, because today is the 25th of May 2017, and this video will hopefully be available tomorrow inshallah ta'ala, which will be the 26th. So I don't expect there to be much fluctuation, but if you are using this data, you know, a week, 2 weeks into Ramadan, then yes, you will need to make sure that you get the most up-to-date data that's available, and it's available on a website that we use, which is the Wifaqul Ulama website. So if you go to the Wifaqul Ulama website, you'll see on there it'll have the financial numbers. So if there's a search bar, and if you search nisab on there or financial numbers on there and click, you'll be able to get the actual silver price and the gold price. You will see the values for the nisab values on there will be different. From memory, I think it's 87.47 grams for a dinar and 612.5 for the weight of a dirham. Now that's based upon Mufti Shafi Saab's original calculations, which most calculations are based on that, because that again is probably the only place where we see first-hand data collected. However, what I'm suggesting here, this is more up to date in terms of the procedure that's been followed and the equipment that's been used and the methodology that's been applied. So that works out on today's price of 43p gram of silver to be £323.36, which means that if you've got over that £323.36 and you've had that money for a lunar year, which is why it's best if you go from Ramadan to Ramadan, then zakat is due upon you at 2.5%. So that means you work out for £1,000, that's £25. For £100, it's £2.50. So for every £100, it's £2.50, which is hardly anything, to be honest. And that is donated, and it's a good time to give it in the month of Ramadan. As you will be aware, we have on our Telegram channel posted much work that we're doing in various countries, so you can donate to them. Our institute will be open throughout Ramadan from about sort of 8:30 in the morning till about sort of 3:30 in the afternoon. So if you drop by and drop the money off, inshallah, this is based in Bradford, then you can deposit that, and that should be you can leave that, and that shouldn't be a problem. If you then go for the dinar, which is based on the 5.37 grams, that's 20 dinars. That comes to 107.4 grams of gold, which goes to £3,347.66. So most will give you the silver, because it's better to donate. Excuse me. It's better to donate to the poor than not to donate to the poor. So we go for the lesser value. Some have argued, for the sake of Qurbani, to go for the higher value in terms of the gold value, because of the fact that Qurbani is something which, even if you haven't had that for a lunar year and you have in your possession 150 to, you're over that possession, then an animal could cost 110, 120 pound, which is a third of the wealth that you could potentially own. So some have gone towards the dinar for the Qurbani. But it's best that to be on the safe side, that if you've got over 324 pounds, then the Qurbani is due as well. But that's, getting ahead of ourselves, 2 Eids ahead, inshallah. So just to conclude and finish off, we decided that we needed a measure that was independent from any of the other measures that we already had. So meaning the subunit, the components which make up the SAR, and we needed to go, so we basically needed to go to first principles. From the literature review that we did, and I appreciate it's not a very detailed literature review, but it does cover most of those types of books and papers which the majority of the people that are aware of will come across. We found that there was secondary sources that were being used. There was a rare exception in which a primary data was being collected, but in that case the equipment available would not be as accurate as what's found in laboratories now, because this was equipment that we have in our laboratory. And the raw data is not available to be able to determine the experimental method that was adopted, the statistical analysis on the actual raw data collected, what was done. We don't have that available to us. So for that reason, it was required that we conduct our own experiment to determine the value of the dirham and the dinar, and also to see if you can use both capacity and weight or only one. Well, what we found was obviously that based on the above, the dirham was determined using barley grain, and we found that a dirham was 3.76 grams and a dinar was 5.37 grams. The dinar is 43% heavier, so 5.37 divided by 3.76 will give you 1.428 or something, and the dinar is 43% heavier as the theory suggests, which is good because it ties in with the theory which I've already discussed earlier. I think that was in the introduction or just after the introduction, in the Ozan part. Furthermore, we found that if we had to select either capacity or weight, because we had no choice, we couldn't go for both, because we saw the way the densities played a part between the grain and the flour, then we selected weight, because weight could be independently determined and not have to rely on potential areas where error could creep in. So the half sa was calculated to be 1.955 kilograms, and the full sa was calculated to be 3.910 kilograms, and the nisab for silver was 752 grams, and the nisab for gold was 107.4 grams. That, as I said, the paper is available and it will be attached to the YouTube video and on our Telegram channel, so you will be able to read it and hopefully go through it a little bit slower than I just did there. But obviously I'm explaining this to you just to sort of support the original text which is already there, or for those who may not wish to read and may wish to listen to this instead. Walhamdulillahi awwala wa akhirah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
أهلا شرفنا بكم تطيب الحياة بهذا الحضور. وأهلا وسهلا شرفنا بكم تطيب الحياة بهذا الحضور. تطيب الحياة بهذا الحضور.